Everyone. Thanks very much to Sarthak and everybody at the Football Collective for inviting me along. I will say once again, because you will have perhaps been at Football Collective conferences before, have perhaps seen me present previously. I've noticed with the number of participants that usually the room begins to empty when I appear, but seems like everybody's staying on at this time, so that's good of you. Thank you. As you can see, my research I've been doing for quite some time now. As I'll talk through in a few moments, I've adapted the title somewhat to focus on where we are right at this moment, and that is that it's football clubs in a time of crisis, a comparative study of private and community-owned club ownership. I'm actually a PhD student at the Birkbeck Sport Business Centre at the University of London. And also, just as full disclosure, I'm also the network manager for community-owned clubs at the Football Supporters Association. So over the last number of years, getting on for 6 years now, I've been looking at the community-owned club ownership model. The question that my thesis is actually addressing is does the Supporters Trust model of football club ownership actually work? I've got to the point where I am writing this research up right at this moment, having done 23 individual interviews with representatives of clubs, trusts, governing bodies, journalists, academics across England and Wales. That's where the focus of the research is. And I based the theoretical approaches are based on stakeholder and democratic theories. I'm not going to look at those today because there's too much really to talk about with what's been going on, I think, in community ownership and football in general over the last few months, let alone the last few years. My research was leading me to the conclusion that the model does indeed work. There are a number of caveats to that, which again, some of you would have seen if you've seen my research presentations in the past. And then at the end of March, the COVID-19 outbreak arrived and perhaps changed everything, certainly as far as my research was concerned. And as I say there, well, maybe it didn't. So really I've had to reevaluate, and there will be now a new chapter to the work, because basically I don't think I can answer the question until such time as this outbreak is over and we've seen what the effects on the sustainability of the clubs actually is. So looking at just a very brief history of community ownership and the history of supporters trusts. First trust was set up in Northampton Town in 1992 as a result of the club going into administration. The trust then eventually took over the ownership of the football club. Supporters Trust movement really developed out of the setting up by the New Labour government in the late 90s of Supporters Direct, which came about in the year 2000. Majority of those fan-owned clubs have come about as a result of clubs falling into administration. Peak of that around about the time of the ITV Digital collapse, so around about 2000 was the peak of club administrations. But there are other examples of clubs set up in protest, as I'm sure many of you will know, AFC Wimbledon and FC United of Manchester in particular. At present within the EFL, there are 3 supporter-owned clubs: Exeter City, Newport County and AFC Wimbledon. Actually that number is just slightly wrong. It's actually 40 right at the moment, and that's across league and non-league football. But to show the extent of where we've got to, supporter representation hasn't really been great within the upper levels of the game, and clubs like one of the few examples of any supporter involvement with ownership was at Swansea City, and as I've said there, the majority of the successes have indeed been a little further down into the non-league and into the Welsh League as well. The research has looked at a number of measures of success. 2 key ones I'm going to focus on here are sustainability, which is effectively what the Supporters Trust movement is all about. So of all of those clubs that have actually gone into community ownership in the past, only 2 have actually been liquidated, and that was a very, very long time ago as well. The majority of those that have actually moved out of community ownership have been taken over by private investors. There's often the belief that on-field success is somehow damaged by the community ownership model, and I would counter that by saying that of the 40 clubs that have gone into community ownership, those clubs are actually a division higher than when they actually started out. It's biased a little by the fact that some have risen very, very rapidly through the leagues, but it's that sustainability and stability, I think, that we need to focus on. Also, to answer the question, really, we have to look at whether we believe that the private model of ownership actually works, given all of those. Just one figure from many years ago now, but over half of all of the 92 league clubs at one time went into administration, and that's showing no sign of necessarily slowing up. It's slower than it was, but we've seen problems with ownership at Blackpool and Bolton, and most recently at Bury, and I suspect that there will not be very many far behind that. We've seen it just going further up into the Championship that with net debt the way that it stands right at this moment in the Deloitte figures of last year for the 2018-19 season, net debt of £963 million, unsustainable in my view, and operating losses as well, 361 million across those clubs, with only two making pre-tax profits, operating and pre-tax profits. This whole outbreak has undoubtedly changed the way that the community-owned clubs are operating, and obviously the private-owned clubs as well. The impacts just in general, I think just five that I picked out there. National game steps level 3 to 7. FA null and void did that with the records expunged. The remainder of the national game still awaits a decision, and I think the trickle down from decisions made by the Premier League and the EFL. One non-league club has already gone into administration. They did have exceedingly large debts prior to that, and that's Real FC in the Welsh leagues. And already we're looking at potentially setting up a Phoenix club there. So community ownership first to sort of come to the rescue, I think, as a result of that particular administration. We see other knock-on effects as well. AFC filed. It's obviously are looking at reducing budgets, but rather very, very damagingly for the future of the women's game, has announced the disbanding of its women's team as well. And I think just generally across non-league, we've seen, and into the Football League as well, large numbers of clubs using the government's furlough scheme, obviously, to maintain people in employment at their clubs. An FSA survey that I'm privy to has seen, however, that 70% of our community-owned clubs have told us that they are able to or see themselves as sustainable into at least September and beyond. I wonder, given those figures that I've quoted earlier around the Championship clubs, whether they can reasonably be said to be as sustainable and likely to see their way through this particular crisis. And I think there are potential impacts as far as a non-league game, and perhaps my own community-owned clubs as well. Perhaps gaining some support with people not wanting to travel such distances. They may struggle to attract crowds back to Premier League clubs. Perhaps it's a total intangible at this stage, obviously, and obviously some doubts about the game restarting, and that's at all levels, obviously. I'll go through very quickly because I'm fairly conscious of time. The impediments that I was looking at to supporter ownership. So looking at those from a macro, a meso, and a micro factors basis. Money being one of them, very difficult for community clubs to compete with privately owned clubs with major benefactors. A political environment that's not prepared to legislate in favour of cooperative ownership, mutual ownership of football clubs. Meso factors, again, governance and regulation. I think the EFL really did flounder with the situation around Bury. I think governance in general in football maybe needs to look at itself, and perhaps there is a chance for what the FSA have asked for in the in the not too distant past an independent regulator under the Football Association, and really the sheer power of the Premier League is the people that get involved. We have a huge amount of volunteers, but sometimes we have people that get involved at clubs, perhaps not necessarily for the right reasons. So it's again, there's all these factors that pre the outbreak were causing some concerns for the model of community ownership. So really, I'm just asking a series of questions around what the future might be. This research is, as I say, it's going to be a new take on where I was in research. So I'm asking basically, future of the football in the UK. Will there be a reset, perhaps in terms of player wages? Could that even lead into changes in the ownership of football clubs as well? Or will there be a reversion to type? We've seen already the talk around the takeover of Newcastle United, for example. As I said earlier, independent regulation of the game. Will the leagues and their member clubs cede control to an independent regulator? And will that actually be within the FA? Another question that could be led out of this particular crisis as well. And again, as I said earlier, how will the women's game fare too? I think there is a chance now to question the benefactor model more widely. I think that particularly down into the non-leagues, there are huge amounts of examples of clubs using their playing budgets to gain promotion, and the competitive balance is therefore skewed. Or as I ask here, perhaps there might be more of a local feel to some of the clubs, perhaps down into the non-leagues, where the skills of the managers and the coaches and the players, as opposed to just that playing budget, are actually more important, and perhaps even salary caps are introduced. And with these changes, with potential administrations, with a levelling of playing field, are there likely to be more community-owned clubs? I believe it's certainly a possibility, particularly as sustainability becomes the key. Unfortunately, we do still see examples of speculators hovering around our football clubs with not necessarily the right intentions for those football clubs. The community-owned model does defend against that to a very, very large extent, but I think that this particular crisis could make some of our clubs across the country very, very vulnerable. So that's all I have to say today. Thanks very much, Lee, for your chairing of the sessions. I'll put it over to any questions, and there's my contact details if anybody wanted to ask anything offline.